Hi everyone, hi everybody. I'm Alberto Botta. I'm Associate Professor in Economics at the University of Greenwich, and I'm the chair of this session on monetary policy, income distribution, institutional, and stock flow consistent models. We have 4 presentations scheduled. I will be the first one presenting a joint paper together with Gabriel Porcile, Danilo Spinola, and Giuliano Toshiro about financial integration, productive development, and fiscal policy space in developing countries. A second presentation will be delivered by Eliana Cristina de Araujo, joint paper again with Elisangela Araujo and Mateus Ramaldo Ribeiro de Fonseca. Are countries that have adopted the targeting inflation regime more resilient to external shocks, evidence from the period 2021. Third presentation by André Verberit, joint paper again together with Luciano Ferreira Gabriel and Luciano Diaz de Carvalho, per capita income and institution and empirical analysis. And final presentation of this session, Grace Yolanda Lerena, together with Jose Ramirez and Francisco Orlando Rosales, analysis of the role of the preference for cash in a sovereign exercise of monetary and fiscal policy, an SFC growth model for a small, open, and dollarized economy, analysis of the Ecuadorian case. So each presentation will last for 15 minutes. Each presentation after the other, and then we will keep questions and demands at the end of all presentation. So without wasting time, I will gonna start. I will share my presentation, and let me know if you can see it. Give me 1 second. Okay. So as I told you, I'm going to present this paper, which is a joint paper together with Gabriel Porcile, Danilo Spinola, and Giuliano Iagima. The topic, the title of this paper is Financial Integration, Productive Development, and Fiscal Policy Space in Developing Economies. Which is the motivation of the paper? Well, I think it is a kind of clear that the COVID-19 first and now the outbreak of the Ukraine war with all the economic consequences of these two events could give rise to a protracted period of economic stagnation. It is equally clear that fiscal policy is expected to play a big role in contrasting this potential period of stagnation. It is kind of clear that fiscal policy might have to pursue ambitious goals both in the short run and in the long run. In the short run, it happened with COVID-19, providing support to households and firms during lockdown. Nowadays, providing support and subsidies to households and firms dealing with the energy crisis. Looking more to the long run, it's clear that a fiscal policy could play a leading role in terms of replacing, to some extent, depressed private investments and to support the transition, the ecological transition towards a system which is more environmental friendly. If fiscal policy is expected to play such an important role in the short run and in the medium and long run, we are wondering in this paper whether emerging and developing countries have enough fiscal policy space to do so, and which is the influence in terms of their fiscal policy space of 30 years of financial integration in the global financial market. We also want to analyze which is the role that the productive development and the productive structure could play in shaping the fiscal policy space available to emerging and developing countries, whether a more or less developed productive structure could ease the task fiscal policymakers and fiscal policy could have to deal with in the near and longer future. For the sake of time, obviously this is not a new topic. This is something that has been already addressed in the previous literature. There has been a long discussion the relationship between the fiscal policy and financial integration. This literature goes back to the literature about the financial repression and the idea that actually fiscal policy itself could be one factor of instability in developing countries due to its pro-cyclical nature, and financial integration, financial liberalization could actually be the remedies against instability caused by fiscal policy. Obviously, this is a more mainstream point of view. There are other views saying that actually the causality nexus goes in the opposite direction, and therefore it is fiscal policy responding to problems possibly created on the external account of an economy. This is, for instance, what implicitly comes from the abundant literature on the so-called external balance constraint growth theory. Even the empirical literature is mixed. In the sake of time, I prefer to skip this brief literature review and move straight to the model, such that hopefully I will have more time to discuss the implication of this model. So, given this general topic, we try to describe a small, open, demand-driven economy, which is partially integrated in the global financial system, partially because we would like to see which are the consequences of increasing or reducing the degree of integration of such an economy in the financial system. And we are describing an economy in which the determination of demand-side variables are basically finance-led. So finance plays a big role in the determination of those components of demand that eventually drive the economy and establish the short and medium run equilibrium of the economy. This is a list of equations describing the four main components of aggregate demand: private consumption, private investments, public purchases, and net exports, all expressed as a ratio of the capital stock, in which I put emphasis on those factors that could influence, better to say, those financial factors and financial variables that could influence the determination of these demand components, and therefore the dynamics of the economy, both in the short run and in the long run. For instance, in the first two equations, giving us the private consumption and private investments, we may have that F, which represents net capital inflows taking place in the economy in the short run, may influence positively, perhaps, private consumption and private investments by feeding a domestic credit boom. It frequently happened in the past that surges in foreign capitals gave rise of stimulated domestic credit booms, supporting the expansion of domestic private consumption and domestic private investments. At the same time, financial related variables such as the real exchange rate Q can equally play a role in defining and determining private consumption or private investments via effects on the purchasing power of households, or alternatively the competitiveness of firms, or balance sheet effects. Appreciation of the nominal and real exchange rate could induce firms, for instance, to upscale their investment project because their balance sheet may become stronger. By the same token, financial related variables could play a role, obviously, in feeding, influencing net exports, for instance. This is the case of the real exchange rate, the fourth equation reported here, but also government decision in terms of public purchases. This is the case of the interest rate R, or alternatively of the external debt stock as a share, as a ratio of productive capital D. Here, for instance, in this equation, we try to capture the idea that the government in many emerging and developing countries could respond by cutting public expenditures when the interest rates increases, and this is a kind of obvious, or alternatively, when the level of external indebtedness of the economy gets bigger. So in a way, many governments in emerging and developing countries are frequently asked to take precautionary stances and cut their public purchases whenever the external debt stock tends to increase and whenever the economy gets relatively more fragile in terms of their external soundness, regardless whether the external debt is prevalently public or private. Sometimes the public sector is also asked to take responsibility for disarrays created by the private sector. If we move on in the description of the model very quickly, these two equations jointly determine the interest rate R as established by the central bank, taking into account some domestic factors and foreign ones, whilst the second equation in these slides describe how capital inflows, net capital inflows are established in every single period of the model. In order to keep the model as simple as possible, at this stage, we departed from considering, we considered inflation as exogenous. We do not take into account distributional conflict, feeding the dynamics of domestic inflation, perhaps on a different track with respect to foreign one. So in inflation, the description of inflation is kept as simple as possible, and we consider inflation exogenous. In a way, therefore, the relatively competitiveness of the economy is captured by the evolution of the nominal exchange rate, which is determined obviously by capital flows. These are the main equations of the model. If we solve the model in the short run, we can get an equilibrium value for capacity utilization, U star, an equilibrium value for private accumulation, K star. The model could feature many properties in the sense that the model could be either could either feature expansionary devaluation or contractionary devaluation, depending on the relative strength of the several forces we foresee in this economy. If, for instance, a balance sheet effect of an exchange rate devaluation prevails, the economy will tend to be contractionary when there is an exchange rate devaluation, or alternatively, if the standard trade effect prevails, the economy will tend to be expansionary when there is a devaluation of the nominal and the real exchange rate. And this applies also, obviously, to the capital accumulation. What is more relevant in our model is our focus on the medium to long run. We describe the dynamics of the economy in the medium to long run by paying attention, by putting together these two dynamic equations. The first dynamic equation is related to the evolution of the real exchange rate, which mainly boils down to the evolution of the nominal exchange rate as determined by factors included in the balance of payment that could give rise to notional deficit or surplus in the balance of payment, and the evolution of the external debt to capital stock ratio. If we put together these dynamic equation, we may have many different scenarios, so the complexity of the model is quite considerable. We need to take into account some specific parametric setting, and under some specific parametric setting, and by studying as usual, the Jacobian matrix of the system, we might have this very traditional dynamics of the economy. The dynamics of the economy is a kind of something we saw frequently in many emerging and developing countries. This is a standard cyclical development of the economy in which there is an initial period of real exchange rate appreciation with booming capital inflows in the economy. But this period very likely will give rise to current account imbalances and the accumulation of external debt. This external debt at some point will be perceived as unsustainable by financial operators, and therefore this will give rise to initial depreciation of the real exchange rate, given that precisely due to the mounting current account imbalances. And when international investors realize the increased risk they are exposed to, given the initial depreciation of the nominal and real exchange rate, then there will be the reversal of capital flows and the collapse of the real exchange rate. So in a way, this is the normal cyclical pattern followed by many developing countries, emerging and developing countries, in the real exchange rate external debt panel. Let's move to the most relevant part of the paper, if you want. So here is the consequences of what happens if those countries, if emerging and developing countries, adopt a pro-austerity strategy, in the sense they implement fiscal austerity in the hope that fiscal austerity could improve the external balance of the country. And from the point of view of the medium to long run analysis, what happened in this country is that if an economic system adopts more rigorous fiscal austerity policies, cut in public expenditures as soon as there are signs of an increasing debt to capital stock ratio or signs of an increasing interest rate, because the premium they have to pay on international market due to mounting uncertainty increases, then what happens is that these measures, instead of stabilizing the dynamics of the economy, could actually give rise to more instability. Why more instability? Because on the one hand, it is true that the economy is made, there's hypothetically more space for a current account surplus, because the reduction of the public spending tends to cut also capacity utilization, and by cutting capacity utilization and domestic demand, there will be less imports. However, this will have a perverse feedback in terms of financial inflows. Financial inflows will be induced to more vigorously enter the economy due to the current account surplus or a potential current account surplus, and this will lead to a further appreciation of the exchange rate, nominal and real exchange rate, therefore giving rise to, compensating for the fiscal policy induced improvement in the current account. On top of this, there are destabilizing forces introduced in the system due to the fact that fiscal policy, by cutting domestic demand, will also tend to curb and reduce private investments. And therefore, the debt to capital stock ratio, rather than stabilizing, could easily get destabilized. And that's why we might have these dynamics in the economy setting in. In all this context, there are positive effects both of a more advanced productive structure and the introduction of capital controls and stronger integration in global value chains. These are the results of the model in these two final slides. On the one hand, if we have a stronger productive structures, this will tend to make the economy stronger, in the sense that the economy is able to support and manage and deal with longer period of exchange rate appreciation. This is an indication that the economy is capable to manage for a longer period of, reduction in their price competitiveness. And this is not a problem, because the economy has a stronger quality competitiveness, if you want. And also the economy is capable to take on board a higher stock of external debt. This seems to be counterintuitive, but in reality it's not, because this is precisely against the so-called debt intolerance. So a country with a stronger productive structure is capable to take responsibility for a larger stock of external debt. The integration in global value chain and introduction of capital controls could further help to stabilize the economy. In this case, the adoption of those measures will change the slope of the Q dot schedule. So the schedule giving us the values for which the real exchange rate is stable over the long run. And as you can see, the results of the implementation of these policies by increasing the sensitivity of the economy to small changes in prices and reducing at the same time the role of financial factors could help to stabilize the economy. I stop here because I'm running out of time. Already run out of time, so I stop. This is just a sum up of what I said so far. I stop the presentation, my presentation, and now I leave the floor to Eliane, who's going to present the second paper of this panel. Please keep question for the once all the presentation are over. Eliane, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I will share my presentation, just a second. Can you see the presentation?
Not yet.
And
it
now?
Is perfect.
Okay. Okay, so thank you, Alberto. Good morning, everybody. I am Eliane Araújo from the State University of Maringá in Brazil. I will present some highlights on the paper External Shocks and Monetary Policy under Inflation Targeting Regime, an analysis of inflation determinants for the period from 2000 to 2021. I wrote this paper with Elisângela from the State University of Maringá and Mateus from Unicesumar. We are very happy and grateful with the opportunity to present the results of our research at this seminar. Initially, I would like to emphasize that this is a work in progress, so comments, suggestions will be welcome. The objective of our paper is to analyze empirically, theoretically, the effects of external shocks in countries that adopted the inflation targeting regime for the period from 2000 to 2021. And to achieve this objective, we divided our research in 5 main sections. In the second section, after the introduction, we provide a theoretical analysis of the inflation targeting regime, discussing its basic assumptions and highlighting the context and the characteristics of the countries that adopted it as a monetary regime. In the section 3, we analyze the economic shocks or crises starting in the 2000s, highlighting the effects on macroeconomic variables as well as the whole of monetary policy in this context. And in section 4, that is the main contribution of our research, we investigate the determinants of inflation through an analysis of panel data for the 31 countries that adopted the inflation targeting regime, developed and developing country. And the contribution of this part is to emphasize other variables that different from the demand side, like commodity price index, exchange rate, a variable that try to represent these external shocks, and in the end represent some concluding remarks and some policy implications of our research. Moving on to our theoretical background. Did I change? I'm sorry. Okay. This paper follows the literature which discuss the new macroeconomic consensus and the main policy recommendation for monetary policy, that is the inflation targeting regime. We discussed that this regime works under the assumption that money has effects only in the short run, but in the longer run, there is no effect, so that the monetary policy should be conducted in a discretionary manner. And in this framework, policy rate should be manipulated in such a way as to drive inflation to the center of some target previously stipulated. It should be raised whenever GDP is growing close to the potential GDP or inflation is close to the established target. And after this background of the inflation targeting regime, we also present the characterization of the inflation targeting regime in the 31 developed and developing countries that adopt this regime in terms of time horizon, in terms of goals, in terms of main characteristics. We make some comparisons of these countries. But I will jump this part and going on to the analysis of the shocks or crises since the 2000s, highlighting the effects on macroeconomic variables as well as the whole of monetary policy and the empirical part. So I can finish the presentation in 15 minutes. In the next slide, we have table 1, and the data in table 1 indicates that there was instability in the world economy at the beginning of the 21st century. As we can see in the table, we can see in the table the summary of some of main shocks that affected the world economy in the last decades. And in this scenario, the behavior of inflation, output, and several macroeconomic.
Eliane,
Yes.
it seems that your slides are frozen, so try perhaps to re-upload them because we are stuck on the fourth slide.
Okay. I will. Actually, I am the slide 5. Just a minute. I will try to share again. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry for that.
No problem. Thank you for letting me know. Just a minute. Sorry.
Don't worry, take your time.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. Actually, I think this slide's better in PDF, so I think I won't have any problem. Okay, could you see the slide that I'm showing, the external shocks?
Yes,
It's
the list
okay.
of crises, the countries, and the corresponding year. Yeah,
Yeah,
this is what you want to.
Okay, sorry.
Perfect.
Before I only discussed the structure of the paper, so I think it was not a problem. So in this slide, we can see this table 1, and it is showing the main shocks that affected the world economy since the 2000s. And we can see that we have main important shocks. And in this scenario, the behavior of inflation, output, and other macroeconomic variables varied considerably. We discussed some data in our paper, Inflation and Economic Growth, and we could see that these shocks demand an effort from the authorities to ensure stability and mitigate the recessive effects on output, inflation, and other variables. And we presented in the paper some figures, but here I will only summarize the main results, and I will jump my slide, and I hope, is it okay? External shocks and monetary policy. Now, in summary, I think so.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So regarding the inflation, the main finds of our paper was that during the shocks, comparing statistics with the countries that adopted the inflation targeting regimes and the world economy, the inflation targeting regime by itself is not a sufficient instrument to guarantee the stabilization of prices, because in most of this year of occurrence of the shocks, the inflation rate was not very different from the average of the countries that don't adopt inflation targets. So actually, if we compare during the shocks in countries that adopted the inflation targeted regimes, the volatility of the inflation is higher than in the rest of the world during the shocks. And as for economic growth, that is the other variable that we compare among the countries that adopt the inflation targets, and between these countries and the world economy, we can see that these recent events of the global crisis, like the subprime crisis, the Eurozone crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and more recently the war in Ukraine and other shocks that we listed in Table 1, these shocks caused recessive effects which seem to be more pronounced in the countries that adopted the inflation targeting regime, given the greater institutional rigidity of this regime. And we discussed these data in detail, but I will move to the econometric section that I think it's one of the contribution of our paper. I will move to slide 7. And in this slide, we present the main equation that we will try to estimate and analyze for this group of countries. And based on our theoretical approach, we chose other variables that are candidates to explain the behavior of inflation. We start from the determinants of inflation in the theoretical framework of inflation targeting regimes, like the output gap, the interest rate, but we added other variables that, based on the post-Keynesian literature and based on our theoretical approach, we think it's are important variables to explain the behavior of the inflation. And this was the equation that we estimated. And it should be noted that in addition to including variables representative of supply shocks in the empirical analysis, another potential contribution of the study is the use of a proxy for a variable for the existence of global conflicts. This variable was calculated by the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, and this variable aims to capture the effects of conflicts in the international environment on the price level data in the area where the conflict is occurring. And these are the main results. We estimated the main models, but we are presenting this result. In the table, we have only 3 models that were estimated. In the first model, we have the results for the total sample, the 31 countries that adopted the inflation targeting regime. Then we divided this group in developing and developed countries. And as for the results, first, we observed that in all the models that we estimated, the lagged deviation of inflation from the target had a positive and significant sign, which can be interpreted as the positive contribution of inflationary inertia on the level of current inflation. For the output gap, that is the demand proxy, that is the variable that represents the pressure on inflation arise from the demand shocks. The results shows that, in fact, increasing the output gap imply an increase in inflation. And another point, and this is important for our research, that the positive and significant sign of the exchange rate is in line with the literature that we discuss on determinants of inflation, which emphasize that exchange rate devaluation tend to cause significant price pressures in domestic economies, and the exception is the model for developed countries, that exchange rate was not significant, only for the whole sample and for developing countries. Also, the coefficient for the commodity prices index that was positive and significant shows that positive variations in the price of commodities contributed to explain domestic inflation in this period in the countries that adopted the inflation targeting regime. And regarding to the proxy for the existence of global conflicts, the results shows that in the model for all countries, it presented a positive and significant coefficient, indicating that positive variations in this index contributed to the increase in inflation in the analyzed period. In the model for developing countries, this proxy was no longer significant, indicating that international conflicts were not a predominant factor in explaining inflation in developing countries, or perhaps the effects are captured by the exchange rate, but we estimate the main models, and this result was the same. So we are present, and I told you that this is still a work in progress, so comments are welcome. In the model for developed countries, different from the
3 minutes left.
Okay, I will almost finishing. In the model for developed countries, the existence of global conflicts stands out as one of the main determinants of inflation, implying that these countries suffered significant from pressures arise from the existence of global conflicts in this period. And finally, one of the surprising results is that the coefficient relative to the exchange rate variable had the expected negative sign, but was not significantly during this period. Was not statistically significant in explaining the inflation gap. And we tried to explain this result, but I think in one of the possible explanation is that there are some econometric studies that show that there is a low sensitivity of the inflation rate to changes in interest rates, so that the stabilization policy based solely on change in the policy rate has been effective in fighting inflation. And the other explanation could be that the exchange rate level in many countries of the sample that was very low and stable during during a significant part of this period, also have contributed to the non-significance of the interest rate in this model. Let's move to the conclusion and finish the presentation in time. So let I change my slide. Okay, so based on these finds, that I told you that is still a preliminary paper, the finds of the econometric model, despite the difference and some results and difference between developed and developing countries, the model indicate that the variables representing the external shocks played a relevant role in explaining inflation. The commodity index, exchange rate, global conflicts, with and these shocks affected the inflation positively in this period. And in this case, the performance of the inflation targeting regime that presupposes only demand inflation ends up leading to suboptimal results, and this leads to the importance of re-evaluate the theories and practice of central banks that adopted this inflation targeting regime. And I think this is the main results. I thank you very much for your attention. And if any of you have any comments or questions, feel free to ask them at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Liane. Very nice presentation. Thank you a lot, and well done. Let's move to the next presentation. Andre, presenting a paper about per capita income and institutional and empirical analysis. So when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you see my presentation?
Not yet. Yes, now it is. So, please.
Okay. So, hello everyone. My name is Andre, and I'm glad to be here. Today I'm going to talk about per capita income in institutions. And the goal of the paper is to analyze how per capita income and economic growth and development are linked to institutions, and how the quality of these institutions can affect the trajectories of economic growth of a country. Okay. So first, to understand the relationship between how per capita income and institutions are related, we first need to understand economic growth under the approach of the institutionalists. So the institutionalist approach brings to the table the idea that economic growth of a country is determined by non-economic variables, especially institutions that are considered exogenous by the neoclassic models. One of the most prominent institutionalist economist, Douglas North, states that political and economic institutions exist to reduce uncertainties resulting from the process of human interactions. That is, they dictate the laws, contracts, codes, and norms of conduct, both formal and informal, that govern societies and thus determine and influence throughout production, transaction, and transformation costs, incentives for innovation and technological development. That is, the institutionalist approach state that the institutions are one of the most relevant variables to understand the economic growth and trajectory of a country. In this way, we can see that institutions are considered by the definition of Douglas North to be the fundamental factor that can determine through intermediary channels of influence the growth trajectory of countries and its per capita income. So thus the difference that we can observe in economic development process are a direct consequence of the different forms of institutional organization in which societies are structured. Following the general approach of Douglas North, one of the most relevant papers and works that we have under the approach of the new institutionalists comes from Acemoglu and Robson, that they propose that the process of economic development is a consequence of the historical trajectory of transformation of a country, political and economic institutions. That is, the difference observed in the levels of production and per capita income of a country are a consequence of the different institutional structures existing in the economic when we look the economic growth and trajectory of a country, to understand the differences between the per capita income of each country under the new institutions approach, we can see that the differences of per capita income and the levels of economic development are a consequence of the way that the countries are organized and the different institutional structures of each country. Furthermore, the authors suggest that the discrepancies observed in the economic growth trajectories throughout history do not exclusively result from the difference in the rates of capital and labor accumulation as presented by the exogenous growth models, but of the existing asymmetry in the institutional structures adopted by each country, and that the existence of self-sustained growth trajectories are directly associated with the existence of more inclusive political and economic institutions. So under the work of Acemoglu and Robson, we can divide institutions in two different groups. The first one being inclusive institutions, and the second one being extractive institutions. Inclusive, the first group made of inclusive institutions, they cover both political and economic institutions and are defined as a set of institutions that allow and ensure the existence and maintenance of individuals' rights and freedoms, that enable and encourage the participation of a large part of society in the political and economic systems. And due to their nature of freedom and they allow the consolidation of plural market structures that stimulate investment in human capital and the development of new technologies. That is, when we look to countries that have achieved development and have higher per capita incomes, we can see that these countries they all present high levels of individual rights and freedoms, and that these high levels of rights and freedoms they allow that the markets grow to plural market structures that stimulate investment. While the extractive institutions are the set of institutions that allow only a small portion of society, usually an elite, to have access to the country's political system and participate and enjoy its economic activities. That is, this elite, they use the institutions and they subvert the institutions of a country in self-benefit. And when we look to the findings of Acemoglu and Robinson and the definition of Douglas North of institution, we can see that both authors and the new institutionalism as a whole, they find that there is a interrelationship between the quality of the institutions in a country and its level of economic growth, and that the economic development of a country are sustained by and this relationship that the quality of the institution is related to the level of economic growth of a country are sustained by a series of empirical works. Um, the most relevant and famous empirical works that show these relationships are brought by Barro, Tavares, and Warsag and Rivera Betts, that they all show throughout econometric evidences that there is a relationship, and that there is a relationship. But despite the econometric evidence that all this work bring to the table, there is no consensus on the way that the channels in which the quality of institutions influences the process of economic growth. That is, we know that there is a relationship between the quality of institutions and economic growth, but we cannot state and say directly what are the channels of influences and in which ways these channels can influence the relationship between economic growth and institutions. One of the first works to propose separately the way that the impact of political and economic institutions on a country's economic growth trajectories is proposed by Ali and Kren. Ali and Kren brings to the table the discussion between the differences of political and economic institutions, and in which way both of these institutions are capable of affecting the economic growth of a country. And as a result of their work, they show that the only variable that can affect the trajectory of a country are the economic the economic the economic variable. Furthermore, Acemoglu, Johnson, Robson, and Jared, they find similar results that those found by Ali and Krem, that suggests there is no causal relationship between changes in income level of a country and changes in its political institutions. That is, both of the works, when I analyze separately the way that economic and political institutions affect the economic growth of a country, they find that only the set of economic institutions can foster economic growth, while political institutions, they play a secondary role on the economic growth of a country.
5 minutes left.
Okay, so I'm gonna run. So in this paper, we try to determine how institutions can affect the per capita income of a country, and then we use a log linear specification for data panel to understand the relationship between them. And this log linear model allows us to test how per capita income is econometrically influenced by political and economic institutions over time. And we use the following model with a log linear specification with panel data, fixed effects, and a Driscoll-Crowley estimator. And for our variables and sample, we use for political institutions the Gini index, military interference, legal enforcement of contracts. And for the set of economic institutions, we use starting a business and protection of property rights. And for control variables, we use a set of 6 variables for a sample of 151 countries, in which 36 are developed and 115 are non-developed. And for results, we have that we can see that for both samples, the economic proxies are positive and statistically significant. And the significance of both variables can be attributed to the fact that the existence of inclusive economic institutions is not necessarily conditioned to the existence of inclusive political institutions. And these findings are corroborated by the findings of Ali Kren and Acemoglu et al. And for political institutions, the set of the variables that were used to represent the political variables, we can see that there is an inverse relationship for the Gini and military intervention. That means that when we have an increase in these variables, we can see a decrease in the per capita income levels. And the results always show that developed countries are, for the most part, countries with institutions with low quality. And thus these factors that can be used to subvert the way that institutions are used, they can affect per capita income and economic growth. And that's why we see this negative relationship. And also in this page, the figure below shows that we have the relationship between military interference and per capita income. Is the figure on the left, that there is this negative relationship, and on the figure on the right we can see that there is also a negative relationship between military interference and inequality. That means that the lowest the quality of the institutions of a country, these variables can be used to subvert the institutions in self-benefit and to expropriate the rest of the society. And as the final remarks of the paper, we can see that the use of this log linear panel data show that for the political institutions proxies, Gini and military interference, they were significant and had a negative relationship for the set of developing countries, meaning that the low quality of institutions can affect the economic growth. And we can also see that the set of economic variables, that starting a business and protection of property rights, they were significant and had a positive relationship for both set of countries. That meaning that the existence of inclusive economic institutions, they can foster economic growth for any country. And the results suggest that the economic growth, it is conditioned to the existence of an economic environment that guarantees the existence of incentives and legal protection, or as defined by Samuel Blair Robinson, the existence of inclusive economic institutions. That means that the economic growth of a country depends both of economic and political institutions, but when countries are more mature and they have higher levels of quality institutions, the political institutions, they tend to...
Andre, please wrap up.
Okay, thank you. And the quality of institutions, they tend to influence less the economic growth of a country because of how mature the institutions are. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre, a lot for your presentation. We're supposed to have a fourth one, fourth presentation, which apparently is not here. So I think if this is the case, I think we will have more time to have a comprehensive discussion about the three presentations we had so far. So I think we can open the floor for questions. If there is any comment or question for the three presenters, very happy to take them and discuss. I have a question myself for Andre, but I will keep it back in the list. So if there is any other question, at the moment we don't have any questions. So I have a question for Andre. Then I will go first. Thank you. First of all, thank you for your presentation. I've been puzzled a little bit by one of your final findings, according to which it seems there is a negative relationship between military interference in, let's say, political and economic affairs, mainly political affairs, and the Gini index. So if I got it right, the higher is the Gini index, the lower should be military interference. So to be honest, this is very, very much surprising to me. So I would have expected precisely the opposite. So in general, I might think, taking the example of Latin American countries, that the higher is the level of inequality characterizing a society and the stronger are elites, the more likely military could take place and military forces could intervene in the political arena. So is there any explanation for this kind of, at least for me, this kind of unexpected result?
So when we look for our findings regarding the relationship between military interference and Gini index, we find that for the most part of the countries that we have a per capita income of around $10,000, we have a military score greater than 7.2, and that means that the higher the military, the higher the indicator, we have that the more interference we have in a country. And this negative relationship that we see for the most part of the curve, we need to see that the curve is not linear, and the relationship is not linear. We can see that the use of military interference, it can be used to subvert the institutions, and also the existence of inequality. They tend to make the political institutions more fragile, and in this way they can use to subvert them.
Okay. So I'm not sure I got it, but I will give a look at the paper and trying to understand a bit better which might be the connection between inequality and military interference in politics. I don't know if there is any other question. If not, I will make another question, in this case to Eliane. So my question is, again, first of all, thanks for the presentation. My question is whether your results are in line with your expectation, because in the end, if I interpret inflation targeting right, inflation targeting basically means that monetary policy institutions mainly focus on inflation, not only inflation, but prevalently inflation. Most of the time, inflation becomes the primary target and the primary goal of a monetary institution. And therefore, it is a kind of expected that to some extent, at least for some macroeconomic variables, countries could become more volatile when hit by shocks, because as it was the case of the Eurozone when there was of Eurozone countries when there was the outbreak of the last financial crisis. In general, the ECB intervened less promptly and less vigorously with respect to what the Federal Reserve did. Well, actually, the ECB for some time, even though in small amounts, increased a little bit the policy rate, because its focus was more on prevalently on inflation rather than on other variables. So I was wondering whether your results is in fact in line with what would have been normal expectation about the volatility of countries, at least in some economic variables, since that the main focus of monetary institution is about inflation.
Okay, so thank you for your question. Actually, when we saw the descriptive statistics, we was waiting for this result, because if we compare in a line graph, the economic growth in the countries that adopted the inflation target and the also the inflation rate in this country, we can see that during the shocks, the economic growth and the inflation rate are higher in the countries that adopt the inflation target, and during the crisis is low than the other countries. So the result was in our statistics descriptive. But a surprise to result, but it was not. I don't know if we have to investigate more. The econometric model was about the interest rate, because we couldn't find a significance in this variable. So we was expecting that this is the main instrument of the inflation targeting regime. So we were surprised with the result, but some years ago when I did a paper to the Brazilian economy, we found the same results, because the interest rate was not significant, but the exchange rate was the main channel for which the interest rate affected the inflation. So we could find these results, and now again. So I think we have to explore more these results, because this is still a work in progress. So we made some estimates, but it's not a final article that will be published. So we have to explore our results, but it was our finds for a while.
In any case, I would say that I totally agree with your final statement that the inflation targeting should be reconsidered at the very least, simply because, and this is very much in line with what you said right now in terms of the effectiveness of using the interest rate as a kind of intermediate variable to control then inflation, simply because, it seems, if inflation depends on many other factors and have many other, mechanisms in the economy, such as distributive forces and conflict between different social classes, I don't understand, at least this is my personal point of view, why the control of inflation has been given exclusively or almost exclusively to monetary institutions via some mechanism which are not so directly connected to distributive dynamics and therefore inflation. Any other question from the audience or from you? If not, I think we might have a longer coffee break before the next session start. I will wait 2 more minutes. If there is not any other question, I will bring this panel to an end. And obviously, I would like to very much thank you for your contribution. Manu, please let me know. I'm asking feedbacks from the director whether we can bring this session to an end, if there is not any other comment. Okay, I think we can close this here. Again, thanks a lot for your contribution. Thanks a lot for the presentation. And well, at some point, I hope to see you in person, either in Brazil or in any other conference of the about structuralist macroeconomics or heterodox economics more generally. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Alberto. Thank you, André. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Bye-bye.